There is just about the few people in the world who have served as prime minister of Palestine or Palestinian Authority. One of them is Salam Fayyad, who served from 2007 to 2013. And he's also an economist who can share a different probably view than what the politicians can say about situation between Israel and Palestine. But we're going to talk mostly about what has happened since October 7th of this year. Mr. Prime Minister, welcome to program N1.
Thank you, Esmir, for having me on. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, what has happened on October 7th is tragedy and disaster. So many lives lost, but also what has happened since October 7th is even bigger disaster and tragedy, especially when it comes to children in Gaza who are losing lives in hundreds every day. So my question to you is how you look at this situation over the last 18 days.
Well, first of all, Esmir, thank you very much again for having me on. I agree with your characterization of the situation. And I would want to really talk about where we stand right now. Where we stand right now is in the midst of a catastrophe we Palestinians have never experienced before. This is really turning into our second Nakba. I'm referring now to the dispossession, displacement, and expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the period 1947-1948. This is a major calamity at the scale that we have not experienced before. The death toll as it stands today, and you mentioned children, close to 2,000 of them, but the total death toll exceeds by far the fatalities that we sustained over the course of all of the escalations that took place between 2006 up until this current round. That is the tragedy that's unfolding before us. And it also exceeds the death toll of the many years of the Second Intifada. Worse, it's still ongoing at a massive scale. I haven't really said anything about the destruction, unprecedented in the history of the conflict. Not to mention, when we really talk about casualties, the thousands upon thousands of those injured. And I haven't, heard much said about those unaccounted for yet. The number there is about 1,500 people missing, presumed by now that nobody knows anything about them. There were indications that some of them were still alive under the rubble, but given the situation and lack of adequate equipment, people desperately trying to undertake some rescue operations, but to no end. So this is really, really a major catastrophe that's unfolding, and it does have important regional consequences and ramifications. People are talking about the possibility of the conflict beginning to cover the broader region, but also the destabilizing impact of the ongoing carnage in Gaza in neighboring Arab countries, not to mention the Palestinian Authority itself. So what is really needed, first and foremost, is to bring this to a halt, to ceasefire immediately. For sure, allowing humanitarian supplies and all, that's very important. But importantly, we need to have ceasefire as quickly as possible. That's where the focus ought to be, to stop the carnage.
Mr. Prime Minister, how you're reacting to what Hamas did on October 7th? And let me put something in context. The former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, I spoke with him last week, and he served at the same time as you from 2006 to 2009. He says that Hamas played by scripture written by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but went further than what was supposed to happen. Do you agree with that opinion of Mr. Olmert? And did Hamas do this because of what has happened in the past, or they just did it because the pressure on them and Gaza was so big as Chief of United Nations Antonio Guterres says, because of the vacuum which was present there for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what the Secretary General had to say about this, I agree with him right there. Now, in terms of the characterization of Mr. Olmert, I mean, there is something there. I think there may be a whiff of uh, an indication or pointing to things that are related to how Israel is managed in terms of Israeli politics. Now, that's a conversation we can have at some point. But I think fundamentally what we're looking at is more is closer to the way the Secretary General has described it. I have learned that in politics, you can't really go discuss and negotiate with people on the basis and talk to them, say, no, I don't believe this and I don't believe that. You take at face value what they tell you and then argue and enter in discussion with a view to coming to conclusions that could help everybody. So in this case, I think a lot was said about what motivated Hamas to do what it did. And again, in addition to what the Secretary General has said generally about the escalation, and this was true, by the way, of previous rounds of escalations, was true of the second intifada. People kind of really are talking about it now. And by the way, I remind you and your viewers of the fact that a lot of people were speculating about the eruption of a third intifada on the basis of what is happening in the West Bank, not in Gaza. Gaza was presumed to be quiet and by the Israelis, and they were operating on the basis of the premise that not much was expected to happen by way of flare-ups that would not be handled and contained quickly. Everybody was preoccupied over the past year with developments in West Bank, insofar as security conditions are concerned. And not many people are paying attention to what's happening in West Bank even today. About 100 people killed there already, not to mention the siege and everything else. But let's keep the focus on Gaza and why what happened. As I said, there's a background to this, a background that applies to all previous rounds of escalation. Hamas, the day of the operation, the morning, they issued a statement in which they cited a number of grievances. What is important to keep in mind here is that the grievances they cited as having inspired them to undertake the attack on southern Israel that they did on October 7 are not Hamas only grievances. They are not specific to Hamas. They are Palestinian grievances. They are legitimate Palestinian grievances, whether it was a reference to what was happening in Jerusalem, whether it's the continued de facto annexation of West Bank, continued settlement activity, whether it was outrageous settler violence and outright acts of terrorism and all of that complicity of the army under the protection of the Israeli army, that is. All of these things were definitely going to lead to something not good, and they were leading to instability already in the West Bank. Now, when you add that to the complete loss of any sense of hope or possibility about a peaceful resolution to the conflict on the basis of the existing paradigm, meaning, Oslo and what came after the Oslo process, you add that is always a constant. I think, beginning in late 1999 onward, 2000 onward, actually, especially after the eruption of Second Intifada. Why did that happen? Loss of hope that, the paradigm that the PLO kind of adopted with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993 and subsequently was going to lead to statehood sometime in 1999, specifically May 1999. It didn't. The minute that did not happen, and there were problems before, people progressively started to lose sense of hope and possibility about there being a state of Palestine emerging at some point on the territory occupied in 1967. So in the background, there are all of these factors that cannot and should not really be ignored when one analyzes the situation in an objective and analytical fashion. So that's what we're really looking at. You can add to that a lot of other considerations, and you could speculate about the motives and all. But this was, a case, I called it a case of the expected happening unexpectedly in terms of the massive scale of it and what happened on October 7 and what is unfolding before our eyes right now. This is a moment of serious reflection and quick reflection on the need to deal with the situation in an urgent fashion, beginning, first things first, stop the carnage. I know some thinking is going into really what needs to happen subsequently. In my humble opinion, that's something that should have been thought through before. The international community, all of its elements should have been really preoccupied with this case as a case of failure that needed attention. There was a lot of investment, in my view, in the idea that the status quo ante was status quo that could be preserved. And here we are. Not only the immediate vicinity, not only the immediate neighborhood, but the broader neighborhood, that's the Middle East, is now in a very, very dangerous place. Again, with the possibility, the prospect of regional escalation, region-wide escalation, not to mention what we already see in terms of the destabilizing impact of this catastrophe on neighboring countries.
Mr. Prime Minister, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, arrived to Tel Aviv to speak with Bibi Netanyahu and Isaac Herzog and other Israeli representatives. But he got the cold shoulder from Amman, Cairo, and Ramallah. King Abdullah told him not to come to Amman. President Sisi put him on a phone. President Abbas didn't even speak to him. Biden spoke 5 times to Bibi Netanyahu and once to President Abbas, and sent his Secretary of State to visit regional players. Can United States be a mediator in this situation with that kind of engagement with Palestinian Authority and with other regional players, especially with King Abdullah?
I don't know, but definitely it has to be involved, obviously. I mean, if we're talking about the United States here. Now, in terms of the background that you mentioned about the meeting that did not happen, it's understandable. There is carnage going on. There was then, there is now a lot more of it. And I think, I'm not privy to the background to how and why the decision was made not to have the meeting, but I can imagine, and I think it's plausible, that, Arab leaders looked at the prospect of a meeting that was not going to lead quickly and promptly to a ceasefire. And they assessed, and I think rightly with good reason, given especially where people in their own countries are emotionally. Everybody is attached to this cause deeply, from Morocco to the Gulf region, everywhere. You see demonstrations everywhere, not only in the region, but also internationally. There's a genuine sense of connectivity to the Palestinian cause that touches people, not only the region, but throughout the world. So looking at the prospect of a meeting that did not produce quick results in terms of ceasefire, provision of humanitarian support that was absolutely essential at the time. I think I'm just guessing, the calculus was like, the optics of this were not really going to look very good. And beyond the optics, the genuine interest that Arab countries had in really bringing this current trend of escalation to a halt is something that definitely should be taken into account. And I believe it made sense. Even President Biden himself commenting on that, I believe, if I recall, I don't remember the words he used exactly, but he expressed understanding because more should be expected of the United States. The idea that I cannot really sense that there is at least beginning of interest in having a ceasefire, but in public, internationally, including the United States. But I sense that in the way, this is being communicated on publicly, ever so gingerly. I didn't quite say ceasefire. I'm talking about statements the President of the United States made. We're really talking about the importance of releasing hostages. Let me tell you, actually, it was very disheartening to hear that the focus, or in publicly commenting on ceasefire, the United States have been saying, or the media reports, at least on the context, are suggesting that the ask of the Israelis is to only delay the ground operation until the Israeli captives in Gaza are released. I'll say something about that in a minute. But on this very issue, I think it's very disappointing that that is the ask and only the ask, because what are we really looking at here? So if in fact that is true, that is the ceiling of the ask now of Israel, which is to hold the ground operation, only the ground operation until the captives are released. What are we really talking about here? No consideration, it appears, is being given to the calamity of the current situation. It is very difficult as it is. Thousands of people are dying every day, 300 to 400 per day, Palestinian lives. That's what we're really talking about. If the ground operation, once it is launched, the losses are going to be substantially more. So the ask should not really be limited to delaying the ground operation. The focus ought to be on what it takes to halt, slow down this mad rush to the abyss, that as I describe it often, and that is what is really required. Now, in parallel, discussions need to take place as to how to contain the situation, and then how to really ensure that we get to a stage where there's sustainable calm and stability. These are all important issues, and consideration of these issues is way, way overdue. This kind of conversation took place back in 2014, for example, and nothing over the past 14 years happened to really begin to address the issues. So that, I think, is where the focus ought to be. Now, the release of some, although it's modest so far, civilian Israeli captives, I think is step in the right direction. I personally expect more of that will happen. I think the push internationally should continue to be on trying to secure a ceasefire as soon as possible. Right now, if you will, I do not know anyone, any Palestinian, who does not know someone who has been already killed, or knows someone who knows someone who has been killed already. So this is the extent of the catastrophe that's unfolding before our eyes. If immediate cessation of the military operations is not secured, the situation can really definitely degenerate into a very hellish kind of situation with ramifications for the entire region. So again, while all of this is happening, while the push, I hope, is being made towards securing ceasefire, and that's very important. It is my hope that the act of releasing the Israeli civilian captives could carve out some space for diplomacy to begin to really actually seriously consider what and how arrangements can be put in place to ensure that there is calm and stability on a sustainable basis, and not for this to really end up being an act of kicking the can down the road, only for another round of escalation to take place, much like we have witnessed over the period since 2006, pretty much, except that the situation was never as dire as it is today. Never.
Yeah, Mr. Prime Minister, many are talking about what after this, and there is discussion who will run Gaza, if anyone will run Gaza. Also, there is discussion about if President Abbas has enough power to run with Fatah Gaza and West Bank, or Palestine will be only on the West Bank. Do you think that there should be a broader international discussion about this to find that sustainable solution, which you said that is needed to stabilize not only Palestine and Israel, but also the entire region of Middle East?
I agree. But before this actually qualifies for an issue to be considered by the international community, it should be first and foremost considered by the Palestinians, by us Palestinians. If you're really talking about the state of separation that has been in place since 2007 in the way it continues to be today, with Gaza under fire and all. If there is a moment in time when bringing that rift to an end is necessary, it cannot be, the need for this cannot be more compelling than it is right now. It is way overdue for this to be brought to an end. And I think good part of the reason why we have been going through one difficulty after another is because this particular issue has not been addressed adequately. So
to interrupt you, Ismail Haniyeh objected your naming as prime minister. He was against that, and that was a part of a rift between Fatah and Hamas. And if I understand it correctly,
well, that's old history now. I think for one thing, and secondly, even if that was the case, and to be honest with you, I have absolutely no recollection of that past now. It's not important. It's not time for it. But even if that was the case, I mean, what really got in the way of getting another prime minister? I mean, it never could have been a serious point of objection. I mean, I never really was part of the problem. I always wanted to really be part of the solution. So, but the time to really discuss this is not now. What we really have is a situation for which there existed a solution for a number of years, but that solution was not adopted, I argue, in the main because of influence of factionalism on the Palestinian scene, political factionalism. And that is really key consideration. Another factor that contributed to this was the international community had this requirement or expectations of the Palestinians that any member of the Palestine Liberation Organization, known otherwise as PLO, has to subscribe to the requirements of the peace accords of 1993. All of the commitments that the PLO took on behalf of all Palestinians in 1993 were to be accepted by any and all factions that could be a part of the PLO. And that was a problem. I've been arguing for a number of years, even if that was the case, we should forget about it. Because the equivalent of those conditions was never expected of the State of Israel. I mean, the conceptual equivalent of those requirements on the Israeli side was the expectation of the Israeli government to formally recognize our right to a fully sovereign state on the territory it occupied in 1967. Now, that requirement was never expected on the Israeli side. So there was a huge deal of asymmetry in what was going on. My own submission on this has been for years to ignore that and see what it is that we Palestinians can converge on, however transitionally, in order for us to be able to bring this rift to an end. And one such idea, which I still am putting on the table today, would be for all factions to join the Palestinian, the PLO, to add to what exists already. Part of the problem we have is some are excluded, and those who are excluded, notably Hamas and Islamic Jihad, have substantial weight with the public. I mean, they definitely have strong support, especially Hamas, in terms of public support that they enjoy. So how can it be that you have something that is considered to be the sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, and it excludes such important players, not to mention people who are not really members of any Palestinian factions, who for very good reason, over the years of failure over the past 3 decades of the peace process to deliver on Palestinian statehood, became disillusioned with the possibility of with the peace process and with the possibility of there ever being a state of Palestine. So those people have to be included. It's possible to really do that. We could have a multi-vision platform transitionally, under which the president can say on behalf of all Palestinians, we can accept this as a possible solution, that as a possible solution. If it is two-state solution that we're really talking about, given the failures of the past 3 years, it's well within the reasonable for us Palestinians to not engage in any negotiations on that outcome until we get a formal recognition by the State of Israel of our right to a state of Palestine on the territory Israel occupied in 1967. I'd remind you and your viewers, if I may, that in 1993, the agreement that the PLO entered into with the state of Israel, under that, the PLO acting on behalf of all Palestinians, recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security. That agreement was that statement of recognition is called Mutual Declaration of Recognition, There's nothing symmetrical about it, because in return for that, we got virtually nothing, just recognition of the PLO as our representative. So to get into a peace process of negotiations in a transactional way, in the way that Oslo process unfolded over the past 3 decades, can lead us nowhere. And look at where we are today. Look at the Israeli rhetoric by cabinet officials on the eve of this last disaster that we're really going through right now, especially our people in Gaza right now, suffering from and enduring hellish kind of existence. I mean, those are still, I mean, even before, life there was virtually impossible, to be honest with you. It appeared as though there's not enough death to go around. That's really how bad things are. So what I say is about time to really make that symmetrical. And given the failure, there was expectation, there was goodwill. Okay, well, maybe this is not symmetrical, but in 5 years we'll have state. Well, guess what? We didn't have a state in 5 years. And here we are. We are more than 2 decades since that was supposed to happen. It didn't happen. It'd be wrong to really expect us to really want to engage another political process without having our right to a state recognized. And then we really can move forward. On the basis of such an understanding of what needs to happen to adjust the political paradigm, I think it's quite possible to get all Palestinian factions sit around the table. I have personally discussed this possibility with all factions over the years and over the past 2 years as well. And I think they all can converge on this. But again, a lot of things got in the way. Factionalism got in the way a lot, but it really never was, at least certainly not in recent years, about who's going to be the government, who's going to be the prime minister or anything. That's just totally secondary. In terms of doctrine, I think this is something that Palestinians can converge on. And to the extent that there is reluctance, I think Arab countries can play a role in encouraging Palestinian actors to actually move in this direction speedily. I just don't see us going anywhere divided in the way we have been since 2007. We definitely need to bring that to an end. That begins to answer the question of what needs to happen, quote unquote, the day after. That day after cannot happen soon enough. It certainly did not arrive soon enough for the thousands who have been killed needlessly. So that kind of approach to trying to bring Palestinian politics together needs to be adopted, or something similar. I wouldn't insist on it, as soon as possible. And it begins to answer the question you raised. What happens? What kind of arrangements? The role of Palestinian Authority. A Palestinian Authority that governs by the consent of all sitting around the expanded PLO has a shot at being the player that leads the period the day after, which I hope it will happen today before tomorrow. It's overdue for that to happen. But the PA, as currently constituted, as currently configured, is not in a position to play that role. Even if there is willingness to do it on the part of the PA, and abstracting from the optics of it coming in after this massive Israeli offensive, unprecedented on Gaza, even abstracting from that, and even setting aside the question of willingness to do it, the more important question, can it do it? The PA has been weakened substantially because of the failure of doctrine on which it stood in terms of peace process and its requirements. And that is major. And that led to actually a decline in how it is perceived by the public, in its standing, legitimacy, and all of that. How can a PA, already weak, which is now a lot weaker, post or in the midst of all that's going on in Gaza right now, how can it really realistically be expected to handle the chores of managing the affairs of Palestinian people in Gaza in an acceptable way in this state of weakness? Clearly, it cannot. The short answer to that question is it cannot. But a PA reconfigured on the basis of an approach to resolving this internal conflict of ours along the lines that I have just sketched, however briefly, I think does have a good shot at being able to do so. One, by consent, in which there is a government that governs the affairs of Palestinian people, both in Gaza and West Bank. It's consented to. It is supposed to run or to assume those responsibilities for a transitional period that is bookended by elections, national elections, with the date certain for elections set and agreed to firmly at the beginning, at the outset of such a transitional period. Something like this could begin to make sense. Now, you may think it takes time, and I think so. You may ask questions like something that has not happened since 10 years or more. Is it really, can it happen now? I would say the gravity of the situation requires no less. It can happen. It is eminently possible based on what I know and the discussion I've been having with many, that it is possible for Palestinian politics to converge on a platform of the kind that I really talked to you about. And consistent with that, something like this can really be, can get going. It's important for that to be the answer to the question that's being asked. After all, Gaza is an integral part of that state of Palestine that was going to emerge and didn't and has not, and it's not likely to under existing conditions and the way the political process has been handled. For that to be the case, it's incumbent on us Palestinians, before we expect the international community to do anything, to really think about who's going to run the show and all of that, and before there is this division about who's going to do it, what role the international community is going to take, what role the Arab countries are going to assume in this process, which is vitally important. I think we, Palestinians, first and foremost, we should really shoulder that responsibility. Gravity of the situation, the lives of our own people requires no less. It's urgent. This is really what we should be doing right now. This is the kind of conversation should be taking place right now. In addition, of course, to continuing to work internationally to ensure enough pressure mounts for an immediate ceasefire.
Mr. Prime Minister, one more question before I let you go. Can you do that if you get unity among Palestinians with Israeli side, with Bibi Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and people like them in government, or do you need someone who could be willing to work with Palestinian side?
Well, we have a version of the Israeli government that is unprecedented in the history of the state of Israel in terms of its ideological disposition. And before October 7th, listening to statements they made, actions they took, the manner in which the cabinet was constituted, it's clear that this government came to really finish the job. The government formally, it's members of the government whose names you mentioned, formally, not only were they hostile to the idea of Palestinian state and said, that to them was not the subject of conversation. It was obvious. They even could not deal with the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is a product of Oslo, continuing to exist. So they wanted to get rid of even the Palestinian Authority. That's what we had. We have a situation that did not really get to that point against the backdrop of nothing. If you ask me, I can tell you, I am not sure personally that there was ever a point in time when there ever was in Israel the center of gravity of the political system in Israel. There never was a point in time when it fully internalized the idea of a fully sovereign state of Palestine on the territory occupied in 1967, especially in the West Bank. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about that because if you really look at ideas that were proposed before, ways in which that state of Palestine was described back even in the 90s, and compare those ideas, and they were expressed by responsible people people in government at the time. With the Trump plan, you find of 2020, you find absolutely no space between the two concepts, either in terms of the territory that Israel was to cede to the Palestinians to have their state on, or importantly, with respect to the sovereignty of it. So the current government, of course, it's extremely difficult. It is an extremist government to the nth degree, but we didn't get here, against the backdrop of nothing. So as far as I'm concerned, we Palestinians cannot do anything to influence the trajectory of Israel. It's not up to us. The Israeli people can choose. They choose their own government. They did that before. They'll continue to do that in the future. We have to deal what we have control over. The Israelis can do whatever it is they want with their own governments, can elect whomever they want to their Knesset. and their political system produces whatever government they want to produce. But we cannot really, as a matter of fact, design our work or decide on what we need to do, and more important, to actually go out and do it, kind of thinking about what they should or should not do, what they're doing or not doing. There are a lot of things we, Palestinians, before anyone else, have to do. What is really stopping us today, for example, from working on and achieving the unity of the kind that I'm really talking to you about? That's absolutely essential. What is really stopping us from investing heavily in empowering our own people? What is really stopping us from embarking on a self-empowerment strategy that empowers our people? These are, of course, it's very difficult to do this under a highly oppressive and capricious occupation regime. I don't need any lectures on that. I know all of that. At the same time, there are a lot of things that we can do. It is my sincere hope, indeed belief, that if we really were to act this way, if we fully assume agency in the act of our liberation, we're going to really get there. There is going to be substantial transformation that is needed in order for settlement to take place, but that has to really begin with us. I think it could have enough power to influence the way the Israelis think about their leadership and the process in which they choose that leadership. We can't just wait until, we have another Israeli government. We had several of them, since the signing of Oslo. And, we have been on a downward trajectory. And now we are in the midst of the catastrophe of all times. It's really time for us to do what we can do and what we must do, and just have a sharp laser focus on this and this only at this stage. Beginning, first things first, stop the carnage that's going on right now in Gaza. That's the most important thing.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so very much for this interview and for your time.
Thank you, Ismail.